The Urantia Book for Dummies. Civilization in Crisis. Chapter 2, Section 2. In the Urantia Book we read, "The purpose of all education should be to foster and further the supreme purpose of life, the development of a majestic and well-balanced personality." Previously, in Chapter 1, we studied this. This is where it gets interesting. One of those conferences that Dr. Sagan organized in 1971 was entitled Communications with Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which asked the question, what does it mean for a civilization to be 1,000,000 years old? He added, "We have had radio telescopes and spaceships for only a few decades. Our technical civilization is just a few hundred years old. An advanced civilization millions of years old is as much beyond us as we are beyond the bush baby or the baboon. How do we speak to a civilization that is millions of years old?" The Urantia Book asks a similar question. How does a civilization that is millions and millions of years old speak to us? Okay, here we go. This is where this gets real interesting. The keynote speaker at this conference was the acclaimed British molecular biologist, biophysicist, neuroscientist, and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Dr. Francis Crick, most noted for being the co-discoverer of the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953, along with Dr. James Watson. At this conference of some of the most important scientists in the field of astrophysics and astrobiology, Dr. Crick and his associate Dr. Leslie Orgel, in an attempt to answer a question that had been asked him over and over and been plaguing him since the DNA discovery, wanted to answer this question: where did this DNA come from? Dr. Crick stepped up to the microphone and proposed an amazing idea: that an advanced extraterrestrial civilization spread the seeds of life throughout the universe, and that life on Earth was the result of this process called directed panspermia. Pan means across. Sperma means seed. Directed means on purpose. Directed panspermia is a hypothesis about the origin of life on Earth. This hypothesis states that life originated elsewhere in the universe and was spread to Earth by directed panspermia. This hypothesis proposes that basic forms of life seeds were deliberately spread by some advanced civilization in an effort to begin life here where they were planted. Crick and Orgel first proposed their directed panspermia theory at this conference on communication with extraterrestrial intelligence, organized by Dr. Carl Sagan in 1971, and they later published it in 1972. This is the published document here. This theory, which they described as a highly unorthodox proposal and bold speculation, was presented as a plausible scientific hypothesis. Crick and Orgel were careful to point out that directed panspermia was not a certainty, but rather a plausible alternative that ought to be taken seriously. Crick repeatedly addressed the question of the origin of life between 1971 and 1988, and he spent the rest of his life exploring what else? Consciousness. Just one of those things that makes you go, You can find out more about this back in Chapter 1, Life Implantation. In Chapter 2, Episode 2, which was the last chapter, we learned from the Urantia Book this: evolution and culture become related as cause and effect. cultural civilization does not flourish without an adequate background of antecedent or previous human civilizational progression, a foundation. Evolution advances stage upon stage upon stage, and it's important for one stage to be stable in order for it to birth the next stage. And that's why tearing down a system isn't a good idea. Let's find out a little bit more about this. To do that, we'll be using this model that we introduced back in section 1. It's based upon the work of the paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and the work of the great mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. Basically, it comes from the field of developmental psychology and the work primarily of Claire Gray, who was a professor of psychology and the originator of a theory of adult human development and human psychological maturity that he called the emergent cyclical levels of existence theory. This was later developed by Don Beck and his work in spiral dynamics, and later integral theorist Ken Wilber. The model that we're using here comes from the philosopher Steve McIntosh, and it's based on his book, Evolution's Purpose. This model fully demonstrates the energy of evolution, and in particular, the energy of the development of the human species. Here's how it works. This spiral represents the full picture of human evolution from the moment we cross the consciousness threshold to become human to the next great leap into the new civilization that we are birthing right now. It tells us about our past, and here the Urantia Book is complete and replete. It tells us about our present and what we need to do to have a future. And it tells us about our future and how to get there. What the Urantia Book tells us is that we are here on this spiral, and we want to get to the next step. This is the next step. Now, ultimately, we want to get to the top of the spiral in this great leap forward that scientists today call a Type 1 civilization. This represents a number of turns on the spiral that we need to accomplish. The Urantia Book calls it the first stage of light and life. The problem that we have is that for now we need to make the next step. The gulf between where we are and where we want to get to is getting bigger and bigger. And if we want to understand how to get here to our future, then we need to understand where we came from and why. And the Urantia Book is complete, replete with the details of how we got here and where we're going. When we call a travel agency, the first question they ask is, where are you going? And the second is, where do you want to leave from? So let's answer that first question first. To help us do that, we have Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at City University in New York, who is also the co-developer of a theory called string theory. Here to help us talk about the future, Dr. Michio Kaku.
I say, looking at the next 100 years, that there are two trends in the world today. The first trend is toward what we call a Type 1 civilization, a planetary civilization, a civilization that resembles something out of Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon. A Type 2 civilization is stellar. They consume so much energy, they can play with stars. That's, for example, the Federation of Planets in Star Trek. Star Trek would represent a typical Type 2 civilization. Now, by the time you reach Type 2, you are immortal. Nothing known to science can destroy a Type 2 civilization. Comets, meteors, earthquakes, even a supernova. A Type 2 civilization would be able to survive even a supernova. The danger is the transition between Type 0 and Type 1. And that's where we are today. We are a Type 0 civilization. We get our energy from dead plants, oil, and coal. But if you get a calculator, you can calculate when we will attain Type 1 status. The answer is, in about 100 years, we will become planetary. We'll be able to harness all the energy output of the planet Earth. We'll play with the weather, earthquakes, volcanoes, anything planetary we will play with. The danger period is now, because we still have the savagery. We still have all the passions. We have all the sectarian fundamentalist ideas circulating around, but we also have nuclear weapons. We have chemical, biological weapons capable of wiping out life on Earth. So I see two trends in the world today. The first trend is toward a multicultural, scientific, tolerant society. And everywhere I go, I see aspects of that birth. For example, what is the internet? Many people have written about the internet, billions and billions of words written about the internet, but to me as a physicist, the internet is the beginning of a type 1 telephone system, a planetary telephone system. So we're privileged to be alive to witness the birth of type 1 technology, a planetary telephone system. What is English? English is the beginning of a type 1 language. Everywhere I go around the earth, people speak English because that's the lingua franca of science, technology, business. They all speak English. It is the #1 second language on the planet Earth. And what is the European Union? The European Union is the beginning of a type 1 economy. And how come these European countries, which have slaughtered each other ever since the ice melted 10,000 years ago, how come they have banded together, put aside their differences to create the European Union? Well, to compete with us. And who are we? We are NAFTA. So we're beginning to see the beginning of a type 1 economy as well. Then we're beginning to see the beginning of a type 1 culture. Everywhere I go, you turn on the radio, and what do you hear? Rock and roll. You hear rap music. You hear youth music. Youth music is now planetary, knows no boundaries around the planet Earth. Everywhere I go, I see high fashion. Chanel, Gucci bags. We're witnessing the birth of a planetary fashion. Also sports. Take a look at the Olympics. Take a look at soccer. We're seeing the beginning of a tribal initiation rite called sports being turned into a planetary initiation rite that unifies the entire planet. So whenever I open the newspaper, every headline I see in the newspaper points to the birth pangs of a type 1 civilization in formation. However, every time I open the newspaper, I also see the opposite trend as well. What is terrorism? Terrorism, in some sense, is a reaction against the creation of a type 1 civilization. Now, most terrorists cannot articulate this. They don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. But what they're reacting to is not modernism. What they're reacting to is the fact that we're headed toward a multicultural, tolerant, scientific society. And that's what they don't want. They don't want science. They want a theocracy. They don't want multiculturalism. They want monoculturalism. So instinctively, they don't like the march toward a type 1 civilization. Now, which tendency will win? I don't know. But I hope that we emerge as a type 1 civilization.
So now perhaps we're beginning to see the importance of what we were talking about back in section 1 of chapter 2, when we said that it's not about what's breaking down, but what is breaking through. Now, Professor Keku may be a bit optimistic on his prediction of 100 years for us to reach a type 1 civilization, because it requires a lot more than just energy to move us to the next level of civilization. But interestingly enough, we may also have been given a clue to the types of civilizations the authors of the Urantia Book come from. That's very interesting. Professor Keku is using the Kardashev scale as a method of measuring a civilization's level of technological advancement. This is based on the amount of energy a civilization is able to utilize on a cosmic scale. It was first proposed in 1964 by Soviet astronomer Nikolai Kardashev. The scale had 3 designated categories called Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. A Type 1 civilization is able to utilize and store energy available from its neighboring star which reaches their planet. And today we are just starting to grasp that and starting to use solar energy. So we're not at a Type 1 civilization yet. Type 2 civilization is able to harness the energy of that entire star. The hypothetical Dyson sphere is an apparatus which would encompass the entire star, our sun, and transfer its energy to the planet. Type 3 civilizations are able to control energy on a scale of their entire host galaxy. Now, various stages of this scale have been proposed since this was first introduced, from a wider range of energy levels, to use the energy matrix other than pure power or pure energy. So they've added a Type 0, which is us, which is still dependent on fossil fuels, and they've added a Type 4 and a Type 5, which would be closer to what the Urantia Book refers to as the various stages of the age of light and life, which is more concerned with the development of mind and consciousness than with material energy and power. The Urantia Book tells us that there are energy systems in and around our planet that we still have no idea that even exist. And the ones that we do know to exist, we still don't have a very good idea of how they work. So now, that answers our first question to our travel agency about where do we want to go. Now let's look at question 2. Where are you leaving from? And for that, we go back to our spiral model. What is apparent, and what the Urantia Book is telling us, is that we are birthing a new perspective, a new worldview, which is bringing into being a new civilization. So, just as we see the new forest growing up amongst the old forest, and the old forest crumbling as the new forest emerges, so it is with our civilization. This new worldview promises to have a major impact on the history of the 21st century. This spiral of development model demonstrates the conjunction of consciousness and culture, and traces the evolution of values through discrete universal stages of development. And by recognizing these sequential stages of development in the evolution of human culture, we can begin to see the next stage of consciousness that is now beginning to appear on the horizon of history. Claire Graves was the first to see how these stages of individual human development are an echo of the stages of human societal history. That is, just as in biological evolution, where we see the human fetus grow through the stages of the entire tree of life as it develops in the womb, we can likewise see within the development of each human mind as it progresses through the stages of human life development, from the infant to the child, to the teenager, to young adult, and then adult. Then, with the winds of time, it seems to move even faster through middle age and onto our senior years. So, just as we can see the development of a human person from an infant to a senior, in a similar manner we can now begin to understand what we'll call the first level of this spiral of development as it validates the evolutionary levels of the human species, starting with the very first beings to cross the consciousness barrier from the womb of the animal kingdom as our place of origin, to the higher consciousness of the human species and then beyond. So as our first ancestors climbed down from their treetop nurseries and took to living on the land, they were faced with huge challenges the like of which we cannot even imagine. They had practically nothing but their fingernails with which to forage, gather food, and fight off predators. They were at the mercy of the jungle, and there is no mercy in the jungle. Here, life was about survival and reproduction. In the Urantia Book, the emergence of humans is presented as having occurred about 1 million years ago, from a branch of superior primates originating from the Lemur ancestor. The first humans were said to have been male and female twins called Andon and Fonta, born 993 2,500 years ago. These twins were superior anatomically to their parents, but what distinguished them, what made them human, was their potential for being self-conscious of identity, personality, and mind. While they had what today we would call a very limited self-awareness, many new emotions early appeared in these human twins. They experienced admiration for both objects and other beings, and exhibited considerable vanity. But the most remarkable advance in emotional development was the sudden appearance of a new group of really human feelings, what we today would call awe, reverence, humility, and even a primitive form of gratitude. Fear, joined with ignorance of natural phenomenon, was about to give birth to primitive religion. Not only were such human feelings manifest in these primitive humans, but many more highly evolved sentiments were also present in rudimentary form. They were mildly cognizant of pity, shame, and reproach, and were acutely conscious of love, hate, and revenge, being also susceptible to marked feelings of jealousy. Andon and Fonta were vaguely aware that they were more than mere animals due to their possession of personality, and to prevent the possibility of interbreeding, they conspired to move away from their animal relatives and fled north. These early Andonites, as the Urantia Book calls them, showed a very markedly clannish spirit. They formed up into what we call family clans. They hunted in groups and never strayed very far from their home site. They seemed to realize that they were an isolated and unique group of living beings and should therefore avoid being separated. They were motivated primarily by food hunger, water, warmth, sex drive, and safety. And they learned quite early by sad experience that in union there is strength. Andon and Fonta had 19 children. Their clans grew, and for 20 generations the Andonites developed a language and established the rudiments of human culture, until tribal conflicts and irritations from outside, as well as competition for food, forced them to disperse. That was during the Ice Age, and while some groups remained behind, others migrated to the north because of fire, and to the west into what is now Europe. Along the rivers and waterways leading to the North Sea, they established more than 1,000 separate settlements, and for tens of thousands of years they dwelt along the Somme River in France. And so we see that the price of survival early became association. Primitive society was thus founded on the reciprocity of necessity and on the enhanced safety of association. And human society has evolved in age-long cycles as a result of this fear of isolation and by means of a reluctant cooperation ever since. But the greatest gift that we receive from this stage of human development is the value of the family. Almost everything of lasting value in civilization has its roots in the family. The family was the first successful peace group, the man and woman learning how to adjust their antagonisms, while at the same time teaching the pursuits of peace to their children, and passing on the information necessary for survival from generation to generation. Here we can see that the function of marriage in evolution is the assurance of race survival, not merely the realization of personal happiness. Primitive desires produced the original society, but ghost fear held it. Common fear was physiological in origin, fear of physical pain, unsatisfied hunger, or some earthly calamity. But ghost fear was a new and sublime sort of terror. The Urantia Book tells us that probably the greatest single factor in the evolution of human society was the ghost dream. Here's why. Although most dreams generally perturbed the primitive mind, the ghost dream actually terrorized early men, driving these superstitious dreamers into each other's arms in willing and earnest association for mutual protection against the vague and unseen imaginary dangers of the spirit world. The ghost dream was one of the earliest appearing differences between the animal and the human type of mind. The Urantia Book tells us that animals do not visualize survival after death. Except for this ghost fear, all society was founded on fundamental needs and biological urges. But ghost fear introduced a new factor in civilization, a fear which reaches out and away from the elemental needs of the individual and which rises far above even the struggles to maintain the group. The dread of the departed spirits of the dead brought to light a new and amazing form of fear, an appalling and powerful terror which contributed to whipping the loose social orders of early ages into the more thoroughly disciplined and better controlled primitive groups of ancient times. These senseless superstitions, some of which still persist, prepared the minds of men through superstitious fears of the unreal and the unnatural for the later discovery of the cosmic perspective to the whole of things in the universe, of which they began to understand slowly that somehow we are a part of that, and thus fostered the beginning of wisdom. Primitive human beings early learned that groups were vastly greater and stronger than the sum of their individual units. The first peace group was the family, then the clan. And so society was born, not of mere association of numbers, but rather as a result of the organization of intelligent and somewhat fearful cooperators. But cooperation is not a natural trait of humans. They learn to cooperate, first through fear, and then later because they discover it is most beneficial in meeting the difficulties of time and guarding against the supposed perils of eternity. So as a result of first war, then trade, and finally for security, clans formed into tribes. And we can see a huge leap forward on our spiral of development. The clans became blood-tied groups within a tribe and formed the early tribal governments, being a loose confederation of these family clans. The clan's headman was always subordinate to the tribal chief, however. In the clan, peace chiefs usually ruled through the motherline, a matriarchal society. In the tribal associations, however, the war chiefs established the fatherline, the patriarchal form of government. Some tribes had female councils, and from time to time, many tribes had female rulers. But this was no place for the lone individual. A loner was helpless unless he bore a tribal mark which testified that he belonged to a group which could certainly avenge any assault made upon him. We see this in the Cain and Abel story of the Hebrew Bible. The life conditions at that time were such that fear drove many of the decisions, because this was a mysterious, threatening, and spirit-controlled world where spirits must be placated above all else, lest they become angry and take it out on us. Here we see that our description of the stages of the spiral picks up right here with the tribal stage of consciousness culture, because this is where human culture, and therefore human consciousness nourished and molded by culture, takes a huge leap forward. Not all at the same time or in the same place, but the cultural features of tribal people from diverse parts of the world in diverse times are remarkably similar in structure and in government. But each has their own culture or flavor. We're told in the Urantia Book that it was this association of tribal social organizations that the races of the human race were born into, called the Sangit race. We're going to talk more about that in another chapter. But as we can see, as the clans eventually formed into larger tribal groups, the human species took another step forward, another turn in the spiral of development. This tribal stage of consciousness and culture was a pretty stable society, and it will continue with little development for thousands and thousands of years, as we have seen. But, as with every stage, it too has its problematic life conditions, and as the people began to resolve the troubles that formed the clans into tribes in the first place, new problems arose out of the accumulated energy that creates a longing for change, for innovation, for something more, for something better, that evolutionary impulse that drives us forward. So we find that the solutions of one stage eventually become the problems of the next. Here, the peaceful clan system was forced, for the sake of higher levels of security, to adapt to living in a more complicated and complex social environment. And now, in this case from the tribal stage, the next stage arises in what many anthropologists today call warrior consciousness, which arises out of what today we may call the angry young man syndrome. Today, we see this stage of awareness arises in children as the ego of a young person differentiates itself from the family. It rises in culture as the youth of the tribe struggle to liberate themselves from the dominance of the tribal restraints. Here, the perceived life conditions of the youth are such that they see an oppressive tribal control system and a pathology within them that craves honor, fears shame, that the world is a jungle full of threats and predators, and it's a dog-eat-dog, so you better bite or you're going to be bitten. Here the tone takes on a to hell with others, I'm going to express myself, gratify my impulses now without any guilt. We're not going to get pushed around anymore. We have to fight to gain control at any cost. It became a trust yourself and no one else. This was a violent, ruthless, moral bankruptcy in the way of ethics that was always at war. And we see this in the tribal situations over and over and over again. We see it in our urban street gangs. We see it in Afghanistan. We see it in the Middle East. There's warrior consciousness that drives this energy into these warring tribes and these warring hordes like Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, and today in our street gangs and our rebellious youth and the angry young individual who takes things into their own hands. But it was also a time of individual empowerment. There was initiative. There was an action-orientated value system. Here, the nobility of the warrior became paramount value system, honor. And this is another turn on the spiral of development of societies to cultures to civilizations. This is a must happen, and it is essential to the development of advanced civilizations. We had to have gone through that. And unfortunately, many places on our planet are still going through that. Here on this chart, we can see how our previous human societies have always been positioned precariously between stability and chaos, between stagnation and innovation, between progress and development, or retrogression and collapse. And many, many, many of our past societies and associations did just that, collapse. Or, through innovation and agreement, they made the turn in the spiral that led away from disaster to a new civilization, a new way of doing things, a new way of even thinking, a new level of consciousness, a new level of culture. Every stage, or turn of the spiral, represents a stage of cultural development, a particular worldview or way of seeing their world. And here we can start to see that each step has a healthy aspect that contributes to the development of the human species, and a pathological aspect, what Steve McIntosh calls a dignity and a disaster. Even after a particular stage has been largely transcended in a society's development, there remains an aspect of that stage which provides an enduring contribution to the spiral as a whole. With the clan, it was the family, and what today we call kin. With the tribe, it was the union, a sense of security through our united efforts. And as such, we were all in this together as brothers of the tribe. A somewhat chauvinistic worldview, granted, but it did lead to the expansion of who we can now call kin. Our arms got longer around whom we would include in our tribal family. That is why each stage has an important value that must be recognized. Once the clan system was successful, it served as the foundation for the tribal system. Once the tribal system was successful, it served as the platform for the next stage. No one stage is more important than the other, as all of these steps are essential to the evolution of consciousness and culture necessary in building a sustainable civilization. Warrior consciousness thus served to break the inertia of the biologically based tribal consciousness and launched consciousness and culture into a whole new way of developmental progression. But the violence and turmoil that is often seen at this stage of consciousness created a kind of birth trauma, a fiery ordeal through which the Urantia Book tells us developing civilization must pass. Understanding the warrior stage and the problematic life conditions of violence, turmoil, and uncertainty that it creates, even today, is important for our understanding of the next sequential stage to emerge in history, which is where the largest group of the Earth's population now lives and finds itself, the evolutionary appearance of the traditional stage. And this constitutes a most significant breakthrough for civilization. Here, the perceived conditions of life were that, with all this violence, this was an evil world without law and order, a world where God's law should reign supreme. Here, the black magic of those criminals over there who are stealing our deer and our women and our land are from a bad God. But our white magic is the one true religion, and our people must sacrifice themselves for the one true way. A black and white sense of right and wrong came into being. Loyalty to the rules of the mythic code, the laws often seen as sent from our God. Salvation was through obedience and faith to these laws, these conventions, and these mores. And this is where the tribal religions codified their myths and legends into holy, sacred books that contained the rules and regulations for living in their society, and often determined who cannot and who can be killed as infidels. But here, their contribution to the spiral was a sense of civic duty, law and order, respect for authority. There was a strong moral regard for our group members, our kin, and a strong regard for preserving the traditions, important days and years of planting, and when was the right thing to do certain things, holy days and festive days. And it encouraged a hope and a sense of faith and loyalty. The organizational structure took over from the war chiefs and the medicine men and the shamans of the tribe and replaced them with kings and priests. And in the early times, their systems were largely dictatorships run in the feudal system with large bureaucracies and military-like organizations. But it began the process of organizing larger and larger groups into societies and cultures that were manageable. The pathology of this particular worldview was that it often had a rigid intolerance, a dogmatic fanaticism, extreme fundamentalism, and certainly chauvinism. The contemporary examples of this we see in religious fundamentalism, extreme nationalism, but today more than half of the world's population lives in a traditional worldview in every society on Earth. With the traditional worldview, we move up the spiral from this egocentric morality of warrior consciousness to a larger, more inclusive ethnocentric morality that strives for a true sense of brotherhood among the members of the in-group, despite any ethnic differences. All brothers of the same faith, as we have seen today between Jewish Israelis and Jewish Ethiopians. Ethnocentrism is a huge step forward from what came before. To understand the dignity and the evolutionary necessity of this stage of consciousness, it is necessary to see how this level acts as an important foundation for the stages of consciousness that come after it. Without a stable base of traditional consciousness, attempts to evolve the higher stages often collapse back into chaos of warrior culture. As a result of corruption and conflict between rival in-groups, we see this all over the world right now. In order for higher levels of civilization to be stable and sustainable, the enduring contributions of the earlier stages must be in place and functioning and carried forward. Traditional worldview has been around in various forms for at least 3,000 years, but only the most successful versions of it have led to the transition to the next stage, known as modernism. From our high vantage point in history, we can now see how each stage has led to the development of the next. In Western civilization, we saw that the abuses of this traditional worldview in the early Christian church led to the Protestant Reformation, which said basically that we don't need priests to interpret the Bible, we can just read the scriptures for ourselves. This led to the Protestant movement setting up huge literacy programs and laid the foundation for what today we call our modern schools. But because of this high level of literacy, science and philosophy became more readable and more popular. And as a result, this ushered in the Age of Enlightenment. And with this, the modern world view and the Industrial Age was born. So now, within the Industrial Age, two systems emerged to produce and distribute the goods and the services necessary to make this new turn in the spiral successful: capitalism and communism. Now, there were others like fascism, but as we saw, it failed miserably, as did communism. And so capitalism became the platform for the next step in the ever-moving spiral of evolutionary development. With modernity came materialism and colonialism and horrifically destructive military technologies, and of course, increasing environmental degradation. But from an evolutionary perspective, this was just another example of one level's solutions creating the next level's problems. Because the culture of modernity was more complex and developed than previous stages, its potential for good or ill were both magnified. Modernity was mostly successful, and its success is demonstrated by the fact that it provided the platform for its own transcendence by the next stage of consciousness to arise in the sequence of history, which is best termed postmodern, a term for the overall stage of culture that has risen in the last 40 years as an alternative to modernism. The postmodern perspective is characterized by a high degree of sensitivity. Sensitivity to those who have been previously marginalized or exploited, sensitivity to the needs and fragility of the environment, and sensitivity to the rising feminine energy of our planet. A particular way of knowing, an intuition that more than ever is needed right now and is coming to the forefront of our cultural consciousness. There's a new spirit rising. So here we are in this postmodern society, and we still can't see how to get to the next step. No solutions are obvious. There are many part solutions, and they're everywhere, and they are very important. But there's an underlying piece of the puzzle that's missing. We have reached that stage that some call limits to growth. We have to make choices and decisions that were not made earlier in our development. But most of all, we need a new perspective, a new consciousness, a new worldview in order to make this correction and steer a path away from chaos and towards a higher turn in the spiral of development. How do we do that? Well, John Kennedy would say, quoting Edmund Burke, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men and women do nothing." Okay, what is it we need to do in order to do something? Well, Uncle Albert would say, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So then how do we bridge this gulf that keeps growing from where we are to where we need to go? Well, please join us in the next section, Section 3 of Chapter 2, Civilization in Crisis, as we look at what the future is going to look like and find out what the Urantia Book has to tell us is the missing piece of the puzzle, the solution to our next step in the turn of the spiral of development. See you then.